Recorded from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's the Last Writing Podcast. I'm Adam Dietz. Welcome. This is episode 5. Appreciate you being here at the Last Writing Podcast, which is a show dedicated to those who dedicate themselves to the craft of writing. Each episode I'm going to talk to a new writer with their own story, level of experience, and wisdom to bring to the table. This is episode 5, as I said. Thus far, I've talked self-publishing, professional writing, comedy writing, film blogging, and this week pop culture. But we'll talk more about that in a second. Whether you're a seasoned writer or just kind of in that aspirational phase of putting pen to paper, I think you'll find this podcast interesting and insightful. We get into the weeds on process and procedure and, talk A to Z, soup to nuts, the nitty gritty about, what it means to be a writer and what goes into writing across various genres. In addition to Last Writing Podcast, I've also launched the Last Writing Journal, which is a publication designed to give voice to burgeoning and fledgling young writers. As far as what we're looking for at this point, looking for most anything. There's a submissions tab on the lastwritingpodcast.com, which will kind of outline specifics, but really at this point, just under 1,000 words. Really keen to build up this publication and help people get published and get voices out there. So if you're interested, please reach out. Would love to see your work. Last week I spoke to Dave Becker. Dave's a heck of a nice guy, very busy writer and podcaster. We talked about his 2,500 movie challenge, building his voice, despite not having any schooling or having really written seriously until he was a little bit older. And then just sort of what it means to write a film review and what he thinks the essential elements are. Nice conversation, fun guy, enjoyed talking to Dave. This week, I spoke to Randall Colburn. Randall is a writer and podcaster. Formerly, he was the editor at the AV Club. Now he's a freelance writer with work at The Ringer, Consequence of Sound, Guardian, and Outline. He's also the co-host of the Losers Club podcast, which is a Stephen King related podcast, and he is a playwright. Really enjoyed talking to Randall. We kind of get into, it's a wide range of conversations. We got to talk Stephen King, obviously. We talk pop culture, Randall building his voice, what it means to be a freelancer in 2021, fandom, and so on and so forth. It was a lot of fun talking to Randall. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. Randall's a real smart guy, very eloquent, articulate, and speaks with great authority on sort of modern culture, and really fun conversation. Really enjoyed talking to Randall. And without further ado, I'll let you go ahead and listen to that conversation. Enjoy.
Hello, how's it going?
Hey, good. How are you, Randall?
I'm good.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Of course, happy to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just finishing up your coverage of The Stand on CBS All Access. I just wrapped it up, man.
Nice.
Baby, can you dig this panel? Indeed. No, I think I liked the coverage more than the show itself. So,
yeah.
That speaks to you and the quality of the show. Yeah.
Well, thanks. Yeah, we were so excited. Like, we wanted the show to be good so bad. And as you could hear in my enduring optimism, that eventually crumbled throughout our coverage.
You banged the drum much longer than most, so that was good. I feel like kind of happened the same thing with Castle Rock as well. You guys you build a lot of episodes around these shows that just end up being okay.
Yeah, we're excited for Lisi's story. We're recording actually the first an episode about the first 2 tonight, and hopefully we've watched the first 4, and it's definitely ambitious, and I think it works, but it depends on your patience for that story, which I think is I don't know, because I'm rereading the book right now too, and I'm not loving it as much as I did when I was younger. So
one of the few I have not read. I think when I was young, I thought it seemed kind of boring as a high schooler. But,
I know. I don't blame you for that. Yeah. I read it when I was in college, and then I haven't read it since then. And I'm struggling with it. But I will say, the bad guy, Dane DeHaan plays the villain, and he's really, really, really good. So there's lots to like about it. I'm excited to see how everyone else feels, because I really don't know.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, look forward to that. I got to check it out. But yeah, today, I've been keen to talk to you for a while, because I think, kind of some shared experiences in terms of like growing up and such. Like I know you're from suburban Detroit. I grew up
Yeah.
in suburban Flint.
Yeah.
Uh, Based on your LinkedIn page, you went to Central Michigan.
Yeah.
I went to Western Michigan.
Nice. Yeah.
Some post grad work. You went to SIU. I went to NIU.
Yeah.
So yeah, some common ground here, which maybe it'll make for an interesting conversation, maybe
Yeah.
not. But
Yeah.
all right, so kind of want to focus today on just your pop culture writing and kind of the modern kind of criticism writing that you do.
Yeah.
So could you kind of start by walking me through just your early kind of days in writing in general? I know there's been stops at Groupon, AV Club, Ringer, and so on. And I used to live in Chicago, so I know a lot of people that worked at Groupon as well. It just seems like a place people kind of pass through. But can you just talk about your early kind of writing work and how it started, how it manifested, and then kind of building your voice?
Yeah. I mean, I've been writing fiction since I was a kid. I wrote like a novel when I was in sixth grade, like a Jurassic Park ripoff. Jurassic Park's what made me want to be a writer. I was obsessed. It was the first adult book I ever read, and I was obsessed with it. So yeah, I wrote a lot through middle school and high school, and when I was in college, I eventually found my way to playwriting because it seemed easier to like make something happen with it. I was able to like stage plays, whereas I didn't really have a lot of resources to get published fiction but I was staging a lot of plays. So I got really into that. And then I studied theater in graduate school as well as writing, creative writing. And and then when I got to Chicago, I've focused on playwriting for a while. And I had a lot of, local success staging plays and working with various people in that regard. And around that time, I also worked at the Goodman Theater in Chicago as an education assistant. So I was writing learning guides for various plays that we would run. And the thing about writing in me is I've never really said no to anything. I'm a very adaptable writer, and I think that especially in kind of the culture of today where pretty much at any job you're kind of expected to do, I don't know, in the old days there was a lot more specialty when it came to things like writing. Now if you work somewhere you tend to have to be able to do all the jobs. So that skill has proven helpful for me because I've always been able to adapt to various kinds of writing. I also, in my early days in Chicago, wrote a lot of grants. I was a grant writer. And I did a lot of technical writing in terms of some freelancing work that I did. I used to write like instruction manuals and stuff. And then as I continued doing theater, I got a job at Groupon, which, yeah, like you mentioned, a lot of people, like especially in the arts community, like that's who they were hiring. So pretty much all my friends and I like all got hired at Groupon. Some people were in customer service, some people were writers, and several people that are on, two people that have been on the Losers Club with me, Dan Caffrey, and then Allison Shoemaker, who was on our early episodes. She started her own pod, so where we amicably parted, but we both worked at Groupon together. We all worked at Groupon together. So that was and that was kind of where Dan and I became friends. So but that was a cool job in just the sense that I had to be funny, and I'd never really had to write jokes before. So that was something and that was in the days when Groupon writing was still funny and was trying to be funny. Sure. It's since, kind of it became more technical during the course of me being there. The company went through a lot of changes, but I was there sort of, at the height of its success and everybody was talking about it, and then through when everybody was like, that company's still around. So, and then moved on from there and started freelancing. And it was while I was at Groupon too that I met Mike Rothman, who was the editor-in-chief of Consequences Sound. And so I'd always been into pop culture writing. I was writing for a local Chicago site called Gaber's Block. I was doing theater reviews and music reviews and stuff for them, but that didn't really pay anything. And then I moved, but that was just sort of an experiment just to see if I was into that kind of writing. And then, because I was buddies with Mike and we would go to a lot of concerts together and stuff, I started reviewing albums for Consequences Sound, and then started doing features, and then eventually became a news writer there. And that's when I was freelancing full time. And then, it was around that time that I, started writing for AV Club too. And I guess for me, it's always been, my journey is saying yes to everything and then finding like new careers like everywhere I turn, which has been sort of neat. But yeah, I think adaptability was something that was always my strength as a writer. And I think a lot of that came from just being, I also always understood from a very young age that like, it's hard to get hired as a writer. It's hard to get paid as a writer. I think a lot of people know that experience. So I was never above writing things that I didn't care about if it meant I was getting paid, because I'd rather do that than work a job I didn't love. I mean, I started working when I was 14 years old. I got a job at McDonald's. My dad drove me to McDonald's and said, get a job, because in Michigan you could work at 14. And so I worked a lot of shitty jobs throughout high school. I worked at Eddie Bauer in the mall. I worked at Sam's Club. I worked at a hospital for a while, doing grunt work. And and I have spell it. I worked this summer at Walmart. Like I worked really shitty jobs for a while, which I think built a lot of character, and helped me understand that, like, even if I'm writing a really boring instruction manual, that's better than working at McDonald's. So, so I think that drive to be adaptable came from sort of that experience.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I logged 4 years at Kroger when I was 15 to 19. So I can relate to the lackluster jobs and so on.
Most definitely.
I did some research prior to this, and it seems like you're very malleable in terms of your writing. I read a Groupon article about oil changes in Milwaukee, because I'm in Milwaukee. I'm in Milwaukee, so I thought, all right, I'll click on this. Let's see what Randall says about oil changes. And then
is that on my like
clippings?
My clippings, yeah, because I think that was back when I was freelancing and I was like taking any job, so I put like an example of all my various bullshit writing.
I loved it. Thought it was great. Best oil change guide I've read to date. But in terms of the criticism and culture, and did you read like film, television criticism growing up? Did you read pop culture writers? If so, which ones? Yeah,
I was obsessed with I don't know. It was when I was really young. If I got like a magazine or something, like let's say a Premiere, or I was really into the WWF, so like WWF magazine. Likewise. Or or like any gaming magazine, even Nintendo Power. I usually would only get one, like my parents I didn't have like a subscription or anything. So if I had a magazine, I usually read it cover to cover, like over and over and over again. And I was always fascinated by gaming criticism and like usually just features. Like I love stories being told about pop culture, because, growing up, I was such a pop culture 90s kid. I was, my whole life was video games and movies and, some TV, but video games, movies, and wrestling were sort of my thing. And I love to be consumed in the worlds of them and know the stories behind them. So I was always reading criticism of that kind. I wouldn't say there was an author that particularly grabbed me until I started reading the AV Club, which was cool when I ended up getting to work there and meeting and talking to a lot of those people. But like Keith Phipps and Scott Tobias were some of the early writers that I really loved. Nathan Rabin was a writer I really loved for a long time. Then Chuck Klosterman, obviously. I think pretty much all dudes kind of go through a Chuck Klosterman phase.
I'm still in it, yeah.
I still like him too. And now, and now I'm writing for Bill Simmons' site, which is well, awesome. He used to work with Chuck Klosterman. So it was so those were the guys. And I think especially Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs, the Chuck Klosterman book, I'd never really read writing about pop culture like that. I think that was sort of maybe my first entry into like somebody writing about Saved by the Bell, right? Yeah. Like Saved by the Bell was the most important show to me in the world when I was like, 8 years old. And I worshiped the ground that show aired on. And so reading an essay, like a critical essay about it that sort of deconstructed it, was a relatively new thing for me. And I remember being fascinated by it. And also I used to be very Christian, and I loved the Left Behind novels. And I remember he had an essay about the Left Behind novels. And I remember thinking that stuff was so interesting because I just never thought about them that way. And I think sort of that process of deconstructing pop culture and finding societal truths or whatever in very silly things. And because I was always, I was never a high art kid. I mean, I always liked some elevated film. I mean, I watched Kubrick and stuff when I was in high school, but I also was really into super dumb things. And I think allowing yourself to be like, to take really super dumb things and find meaning in them was sort of liberating for me, and something that I think I've carried on with, throughout my career, because it's like the things that we end up having sort of an encyclopedic knowledge on can sometimes be so esoteric, and just strange. Like for me, Saved by the Bell or Top Chef, like these are things that I know like the back of my hand, and I found ways over the years to sort of use that encyclopedic knowledge to say I think something that is meaningful to me, and I don't know. I think that's like a pocket of writing that I've always enjoyed reading, so that I naturally was drawn to that.
Yeah, definitely. I remember reading Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs for the first time. I think I was probably 20, and I was down in Brazil teaching, very, very lonely. And I read this book, and I thought, man, I can't believe just the weaving of the NBA, Saved by the Bell, Pam, Man, just all these. Yeah, I was just amazed. I'd never really seen anybody do that so like deftly and in sort of a cool way. Like it just seemed very cool and hip, and I really admired that. But yeah, that's funny. Do you remember any early, like, when you were younger, did you write film reviews just kind of recreationally, or was that not something you got into until later?
The first review I ever wrote, and it wasn't really a review, it was more of a critical essay, was my brother is 4 years older than me, and he wasn't a reader. He didn't like reading. So he was a big jock. And so when he was a sophomore in high school, he had to write an essay where he read 3 books by the same author and like examine themes that mingled between them, and he didn't want to do that, and he knew that I read a lot of Michael Crichton at the time, so he asked me if I would write his essay for him about Michael Crichton. So I did. I was in 6th grade, and he ended up getting a B- on it, which I think is pretty good for me being in 6th grade.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, and so, but he wasn't wholly happy. He wanted a better grade, but he was at least grateful that I did it for him. And that was, I think, the first time I actually started thinking critically about stuff I was reading. And then for reviews and stuff, yeah, I had a column in the high school newspaper where I would review movies. But it was really just, I don't know, it was me kind of just flaunting the indie films that I watched. Like, even if I didn't like them, I would usually write about them because they made me seem cool. Right. I was just writing about like Jim Jarmusch films and
high schoolers love Jim Jarmusch.
Exactly.
Notoriously.
Yeah, it was pretty like standard stuff in terms of what high school dudes are into. I was writing a lot about that. And yeah, so I think that was like my first foray into that. And I kind of always found my way back around to it. When I was in college, I was a journalism minor, but I didn't even take that on until a couple of years in. But I wrote for the paper in college, and I would do music reviews. And I never did film reviews in college, but I did a lot of music reviews, and I did theater reviews. And those were the things that they were horrible, but they were things that they were me sort of learning the whole process. And then when I was in grad school, I took a break from all that, and I was focused on creative things. And then when I got to Chicago, it was pretty much just like, how can I make money writing? And but I guess the tough thing is like, and this is a very unpopular sentiment these days, and for good reason, but I think it just ignores sort of a central reality, which is that you usually have to write for free a lot before anybody's going to pay you to write for them. And that was something that I sort of understood having worked in creative fields, where especially in theater, where you're pretty much paying to stage your own work at first just to get people to see it, and then eventually, and it worked in the sense that I did that enough that eventually people started paying me to write plays, and that was really cool. But it was similar with media writing. And so yeah, when I started writing for Gaper's Block, it was more about getting my foot in the door, because it didn't pay, but I would get free tickets to stuff, and I would, get to go to concerts and get to go to plays, and that was cool. And then eventually I started getting paid doing longer features, but yeah, it was just a hobby for a long time. The media writing was, and eventually I was able to work it into a career, which is neat. But yeah, but it's a really volatile industry, and there's no money. So it's like I say, well, when I say I'm getting paid, I'm not like when you're freelancing, you have to cobble together a lot to make a living because compared to how things were 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, I mean, the money is just not the same. I mean, a lot of the big media, the big publications are either being bled dry by venture capital or, they're limping along independently, but they're usually not able to pay very much. And that's why we sort of live in this Patreon, GoFundMe culture, which is essentially like, the only way to make money doing art anymore for most people is to crowdfund it. And, which is just a depressing reality of our times. Although that said, it does give you a lot of freedom in terms of not having any, corporate foot to kiss. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. In terms of, I wanted to reference something. This is kind of a deep cut, but you said this on a we just talked about Patreon, but a Loser Club Patreon episode. I think it was for In the Mouth of Madness.
Okay.
Where you were kind of talking about maybe your complicated relationship to writing, and I'm going to paraphrase this, so I'll let you say it the right way. But you were kind of saying that overall you enjoy writing, you're grateful to have been able to make a career out of it, but it fills you with considerable dread. And that might have just been a mood for the day, but is that a feeling you have commonly? Is that sort of an accurate depiction of your relationship to writing?
Well, I think at the time it was. Honestly, I'm a lot happier and more excited about writing these days because I'm back to freelancing. At the time I was fully employed, and I'd worked for, a couple different media organizations. And I think the tough thing about writing in media is that we live in a very sort of contentious culture. And I think social media obviously fuels a lot of it. We live in sort of a reactionary culture and a hot take culture. And there is a certain pressure when you work at organizations like that to develop takes and approaches to material that will get the most eyes. And I think in doing so, sometimes you're compromising the way that you'd prefer to write. And you're perhaps exacerbating certain feelings that you have in order to draw together a more coherent thesis or, a clearer side of an issue. And I think in that sense, and also at the time I was writing timely content, which is essentially whatever's happening, whatever's trending is what we have to write about. And when you do that, you're kind of never, you're never off the clock because things are happening all the time and you have to pay attention to them and develop reactions and takes on them. And it's a pretty exhausting way to operate. And I think it takes a very specific sort of person. I think I was very good at it for a long time, but it does wear on you. And so I remember when we recorded that episode, I was still in my previous job, and I think I was filled with dread about, the idea that I'm going to wake up in the morning and is it going to be a fun day of writing or is it going to be a, Bryan Singer has been accused of ... kind of day. And you're also writing about extremely sensitive things on really tight deadlines. So there's that too. So I think when you're writing it from that perspective and you're responding to culture and you're also, basically dropping little hand grenades on social media every time you write anything because people have opinions about, which is fine, but it's like people have opinions and they have vessels with which to express those opinions instantly. I think that writing can become a very stressful sort of thing. These days, I'm much less stressed because I'm focusing more on creative projects as well as freelance projects, and I have the freedom to do so right now. And I'm also writing and creating, we have the podcast as well. And the podcast is really great because, we're creating content that is, for an audience that is invested like that, and that's the nice thing about doing a podcast on a specific subject. We do a podcast on Stephen King. So, it's great because it's more of a community. It's a community of people who who are engaged, who want to hear what we say, they're hitting play on our episodes. We're not thrusting this in people's faces. They are choosing to engage with it. And that's a really healthy approach to content creation, I think, because, when you're working with, like when you're creating content for an audience that is supportive, it's a lot easier to have, productive dialogue, constructive dialogue, and have fun. So there's that. And then, and I'm also just a little bit less beholden to the clock now. I'm not cranking out things on tight deadlines. And I'm not, I'm not as desperate to write things that sort of dovetail with the zeitgeist, which can be it's exhausting. I think we all need breaks from the discourse and from the news ticker. And so I think the dread aspect of it, I think there's still dread, when you approach a creative project, because and even King talks about this, like when he put off writing Wizard and Glass for so long because he was afraid of writing it. He thought he wouldn't be able to pull it off. And he wrote in the afterword of the book that, starting is the hardest part. Like, it's difficult to begin. And I think there's dread in that too. I mean, when I have various creative projects I'm working on, and whenever you sit down to work on it, sometimes it's, the same every day, and that, every time you sit down, you're starting from scratch again. And there's dread inherent to that too, but I would at least say it's less palpable than it used to be. I think I'm starting in this process of rediscovering the joys of writing, which it is considerable. But yeah, I think every writer who does it for a career, and once you take this thing that you used to do for passion, and it becomes fueled by the demands of labor and market capital and everything, it becomes a bit more laborious. So yeah.
Yeah, sorry to, to bring the mood down. I remember when you said that, I that really, it seemed very poignant to me. I was on the treadmill and I thought, okay, let's circle back on this.
Why was it poignant to you?
Just the dread in general. My career is writing as well. And I just think sitting down in front of a Google Doc and the cursor is just blinking back at you and just thinking like I'm a fraud. I will not be able to write this blog on flooring or Milwaukee oil changes. Everyone's going to know I don't know about oil changes.
I know, right?
And I'm going to be exposed.
And it never goes away, that feeling. And I think that's that. I agree wholeheartedly. I've found myself in this place because I'm actually I'm working on a novel right now, and I haven't written fiction since college. So this is a new experience. It's a refreshed experience for me. And I keep thinking about all the sentences I'm not writing. I keep thinking this sentence could be so much better than it is right now. And I think that's a really unhealthy way to do it, because once you start saying like, like you read a sentence in another book and you say, why can't I write anything like that? And you say, well, that's because that's not me. I am not that writer. I mean, the whole point of writing, is to express your point of view and your style and your thought process and your ideas. And I think a lot of times we feel like we have to write like other people in order to be successful or to be respected. But oftentimes the reason people respond to your writing in the first place is because, you have a voice already. And just because you think a sentence sucks right now, that doesn't mean everybody else is going to think it sucks. And I mean, obviously push yourself to write a better sentence if you think the sentence sucks, but some sentences
are bad.
Yeah, some are bad, but also don't automatically assume that you are incapable of writing a good sentence.
Every sentence is bad.
Yeah. I know. I feel that way every time I write, but then I remind myself that, and honestly, just the fact that you can write a sentence at all is something I'm always reminding myself is something to be proud of. I think that because the whole point of writing is to finish something, and finishing is the most important aspect of any writing, even if everything you've written is absolute garbage, because, rewriting is a lot easier than writing. And, if you finish something, you're one step closer to, really finishing it and showing it to the world. And, the longer you sit on an unfinished draft, I think the more stale it grows ultimately.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, definitely. No, that makes sense. I was struck by your comment earlier about how, working for AV Club or any cultural website versus, the discourse with the Losers Club podcast is interesting because when you're communicating with a group of of like-minded people that are kind of coming to you, the discourse is just generally going to be more healthy. Like someone could say, I don't like the girl who loves Tom Gordon. And you could say, well, I do for these reasons. And it's not just such a contentious kind of back and forth. And I could see how that would ultimately be a relief if you're used to people just immediately coming at you for an opinion that you have online. So,
well, it's true. And I think that's a hard thing about, I think some people really thrive on it. And those are the people who I think are really built for media writing and that kind of thing is some people love sort of people to come at them and start tearing down their thesis. And for me, I love healthy discourse, but it's becoming harder to find these days. But I think that's why, writing is in some way, writing and also creating, I think in general, more communities are being formed. And I think Patreon, that kind of culture is a big part of that, is it's another way of cultivating a community for a project that you are creating. And that's where the healthy discourse is created. And that's what I love about the Losers Club in a lot of ways is, on the podcast, me and the different hosts, we often have different opinions on things. But one of the reasons we all like being on the pod together is that we can have healthy arguments, and and it helps that we've all been friends for a pretty long time that we're able to have those. But I've noticed too, we launched a Discord channel for our patrons, and it's great. Like I was worried when I opened it that, I laid out all these ground rules about, being supportive and not being a jerk to other people. And I haven't seen any of that on the Discord. When people have differing opinions, it's all very lighthearted. And I think that some people are perhaps retreating to these kinds of communities to avoid maybe the toxicity that can exist online. And sometimes I feel that way about my career because I think when you're working in media, it's impossible, even if you're writing the most toothless articles, it's impossible to sort of avoid the toxicity that is inherent to what we can call the capital D discourse. And so, so I think that is a big part of, because that's a big thing with writing too. Like if you're writing fiction or you're writing theater, you're writing anything, is about finding your readers, right? And like, who are you writing this for? And who do you want? Like, that's one thing with my novel I'm working on right now is I have certain people that I turn to for certain projects, but this is a different kind of project. And so I'm trying to figure out who my readers are and who I want to share this with before I share it with the world at large, because you want to find people who, aren't going to be jerks, but you also want to find people who will challenge you in a way that is healthy and people whose opinions that you respect. That's a big part of it. You don't just want to take notes from anybody. You want to take notes from people who you feel like are aligned with your goals as a creator. So
that makes sense. Yeah. So I want to talk about something I like to do on the show here is kind of get in the weeds on one specific piece and really focus on just like process and kind of soup to nuts, A to Z, how, something came from idea to, getting published. And this is one that you wrote pretty recently for The Ringer. And it's the MTV's Next Great Challenge.
Yeah.
It was fantastic. I loved reading it. It was so well done. But yeah, what I'd like you to do is sort of just talk about the inception of it, all of the sort of details, the innate details, any mutations over time, edits, back and forth with Ringer editors, and then just basically everything that happened prior to publication.
Yeah, sure. This was a fun piece because I grew up watching The Real World and The Challenge, and I kind of rediscovered The Challenge again probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And I love trash TV because when I was working at the AV Club, and even before that, when I was working at Consequence of Sound and various other places, when you write about culture for a living, it's hard to not feel like you're always working if you're a culture lover. So every time I was watching a show or watching a movie, a lot of times I was watching things because they were part of the discourse and I needed to be up on it. And I always watched The Challenge and stuff like that because it felt like, well, I'm never going to have to write about this, This is just something I can turn my brain off and watch. But of course, I usually end up writing about those things anyways. But anyways, I got invested in that stuff, and I was watching The Real World, or the Challenge All-Stars on Paramount Plus. And the first episode has a needle drop by Bush, and it's the song Machine Head. And I literally, I tweeted about this at the time, but my jaw dropped. It was just one of those, it was such an instant splash of like nostalgia that hit me. And it's because and I talk about this in the intro of my piece, is that this is a song that hasn't necessarily persevered through culture. And that's not to say it's not a great song. It is a great song, but it hasn't persevered through culture. It hasn't been memed. It hasn't been on TikTok. It hasn't like been a song that plays on classic rock radio or anything like that. It just is a song that people very much remember from that time. And when it begins and has such an identifiable opening that it sort of hits you. And that hit me so strikingly that I started to notice all the other music cues on the show, which were all very much indebted to MTV's video music era when they played music videos, and which was specifically when I was at the prime age of watching music videos when I was younger. So, and then I started just thinking about, well, a lot of the people on this show, because this is an all-star season, are people who were on MTV, you know, in the years when they still played music videos. And I started thinking about this general strategy that Paramount Plus is doing and sort of cultivating nostalgia in a lot of their properties, because it had been announced around that time that they were also developing remakes or reboots of stuff like The Italian Job and Love Story and Flashdance and just these random properties. And I'm obsessed with IP culture because it's so cynical, but certain creators have found ways to create original, interesting things out of existing IP, out of necessity. Like a lot of stuff would not be attached to IP if we were in a different culture. Like Fargo is a great example. Noah Hawley's Fargo. It's not a perfect show, but when it's good, it's really good. And it's a show that isn't really indebted to the movie that much, aside from the fact that it, you know, references the Coen brothers and visually a lot. And the plots are, you know, narratively. Yeah, it's quirky in the same, it captures a similar tone, but the show is telling original stories. And that's what I like about it. And I think that is what a lot of creators have to do these days, because studios want IP, and they don't really care how you get there. Usually they just want you to use the IP. And so I started thinking about IP and the way that Paramount Plus was using it, and just because they just did the Real World reunion. They reunited the first season of the Real World, and they're bringing back like the OMTV Raps and Unplugged, and I'm just like, okay, like they want us to remember that, you know, because if you look at the main channel right now, and Ringer, this was also part of my process in that Ringer had written a whole piece last year about how MTV plays the show Ridiculousness like 20 hours a day, which was to me a fascinating story. And but the thing is, it works, you know. The problem is it dilutes the brand. And so I was thinking a lot about how they're trying to do this, you know. It's obvious, like I'm not even like projecting that much. It's obvious that with Paramount Plus, which is, you know, is a Viacom CBS property streamer, so it has access to all of MTV stuff, and they also uploaded all these old episodes and seasons, and I've been rewatching old episodes of The Challenge like while I cook and stuff. And so my mind was spinning around just this idea of these two different tracks, right? Like they still can get their their like 12 to 28 demo on MTV proper, because they still have some original shows they air besides Ridiculousness, and most of those, you know, do cater to Gen Z. They're more sexually fluid. They're more they're about young people. And they also, like, Ridiculousness is a show that works because it sort of is like watching a series of videos on TikTok. And but the thing is, in doing that, you've lost the older millennials, the Gen X, the boomers who used to watch MTV. And clearly that's what Paramount Plus is trying to do, is win them back. And to me, it just seemed like a pretty simple story idea, examining sort of that tension. And the nice thing is I started writing for The Ringer a little bit. A couple months ago, I was writing articles about wrestling, and then I was like, well, this might be a good fit for their TV section, because I want to work with them more, because they're great. And they actually pay a decent wage, unlike most publications these days. So I pitched their TV editor, and well, it wasn't TV editor, it was their features editor. And I got his name from the editor I had been working with on the wrestling end of things. And yeah, I just wrote a pitch email kind of breaking down all of the things I just told you. But, you know, when you pitch people, you have to make it a lot tighter and a lot, you know, more coherent. You have to sort of map out the piece before you pitch, which can be really difficult. But I also pitched it because the Challenge the Ringer has a long history of loving the Challenge. They call Bill Simmons calls it America's fifth national sport. So and I've listened to a lot of the podcasts where they talk about it. So, you know, so to me, it seemed like a natural fit. And then luckily it was, the editor really liked it. And, but the tough thing was I had about 5 or 6 days to turn the whole thing around, which is tough because I'd been thinking about it for a long time, but writing is hard. And also they wanted me to do some reporting with it, talk to some people at MTV. That was a request on their end, which I probably would have done anyways. But yeah, like them saying that is also great. So they were just like, yeah, talk to some producers at MTV. So reached out to MTV's PR. They were very keen on it because, the Ringer's very kind to the challenge. And the thing about media these days is, publications are going to be a lot more likely to work, or networks and conglomerates are going to be a lot more likely to work with you if the publication or you as a writer have a strong history of writing positively about them.
Sure.
That's just the state of things right now. And access journalism is a whole discussion right now. And, but, I kind of use that to my advantage in the sense that, Ringer and MTV have a good relationship. Opened up that, I was able to, and I wanted to speak to the music supervisor as well as, a producer on the show. And I got to speak to actually the head of Bunim Murray, the president, because they are an executive producer on it. And that was really exciting because I was able to talk to them about the whole strategy of what they're doing on Paramount Plus. And then also I talked to the music supervisor, which was great. And then I also found what you'd call an expert. So I found this woman named Amanda who I kind of looked up, like, who's writing critically about the real world and the challenge these days. I'm not the only one. So I found this woman who just published a book this year about the real world and the evolution of reality TV on MTV over the years, which is to me just an interesting topic because I haven't stuck with it, but I've seen the evolution. And so I found her and she was game to talk. So yeah, it was one of the sources found themselves pretty easy. When you're writing an article, it's always good to talk to some kind of expert. It's usually a professor or something like that. And this woman was a professor, but I was, clearly she has this sort of side interest in reality TV. And I also just love talking critically about reality TV. Because to me, it's a lot of people I think have a very cynical view of it. And I do to a degree, but I think that one of the ideas that I talked about with her and I talked about in the piece was the idea of how now that reality TV's been a thing for 30 years, I've realized kind of watching this Road Rules or the Real World reunion and the challenge and everything, I'm watching these people age alongside me, right?
Yeah.
These are people I used to watch and they were only a few years older than me. And now I watch them and they've all got kids and they've got careers and they've got wrinkles. And there's a pathos to that that's very different than, say, reviving Flashdance or reviving Love Story and just taking these characters of this story that's old and reviving it via IP. If you're rebooting a reality property and you're bringing back the same people, there's something affecting about seeing the way that they've aged and the way that, their evolution mirrors yours, because reality stars are different than movie stars. And that's just an idea that's very interesting to me. So, once I talked to all those people, I kind of, I presented all those ideas and we had a good discussion about it. I sat down, I started writing, and it was tough because I had a trip scheduled with my wife to go to Florida for a couple days to see her older brother's new house. So I was in Florida for the majority of me writing the piece while the family was out swimming in the pool. I was in my room writing
about the challenge,
in the real world. Yeah. And I'm trying to explain to them what it is. And they're just like, that show's still on,
Johnny Bananas?
Johnny Bananas.
I guess.
I know. And so that was an interesting thing. So I wrote the piece over about 2 days, and then I sent it off to my editor, and he got back to me pretty quickly. And yeah, the edits were nothing. There was no huge overhaul. They were pretty happy with the piece, but there was a couple really, really good questions. That's the good thing about an editor is they won't rewrite your prose, right? They might punch it up a little bit, which is makes sense. And but really good editors ask hard questions about they'll say, or they'll just say I don't think you've earned this. I don't think you've earned this sentence, earn that harder, Right. And so those were some of the notes was, I'm not sure I believe this sentence on its own. What can you do to supplant that? Or, what are you really getting at when you're saying this sentence? Or sometimes just, what does this mean? Which happens to me sometimes, because sometimes I'll write sentences that are a bit too complicated, too many commas, and then they're just kind of like, this reads like gobbledygook. So you clean it up, you answer their questions, and hopefully you can answer their questions. Like in one instance, I had made a comparison. I tried to draw a comparison between the Challenge All-Stars and Paramount Plus's strategy in a way where I was stretching, like in terms of metaphor. So, they kind of said, I'm not sure I buy this. Can you punch it up? And I ended up just being like, it's better if I just cut it. I think a lot of times we try to, polish a turd or something, and it's good to just chop it. So the edits were really great. And that's the thing with a good edit too, is you come out of it feeling like you've made the piece better. And that's not always the case. I've had pieces in the past where I've gotten edits from an editor where I said, I understand, you sort of understand the power structure, and you can fight back on edits a little bit, but if they persist, ultimately you're writing for their publication. You sort of have to acquiesce. And sometimes I feel like it's made my pieces worse, but in this instance, I thought it made the piece a lot better. And the piece ran literally the morning after I turned it in. So the turnaround is usually pretty tight on these, especially because I talked about timely content. Everything is kind of based on timeliness these days. Not everything, but most content. And the turnaround on that piece from pitching to publication was probably about 2 weeks. But the thing is, it takes a while to get that first response. Yeah. Like from an editor, you usually have to hassle them because they're getting 8,000 emails. I used to be an editor, so I know this. You got emails just piling in the inbox. And if you're a freelancer and you're afraid to send that second follow-up email, don't be, because you need to send the follow-up email. Yeah. That's like the best advice I would give, because when I was freelancing several years ago, I was always afraid to send follow-ups, thinking that they would be annoyed.
Annoying. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's best, you usually should wait 4 to 5 days, I'd say. Before you send that, you want to give them time. But at the same time, when turnarounds are tight, you want to make sure that you're going to have time to work on the piece. So I think that's like the general story with that one.
How many hours do you think A to Z, I guess, how many writing hours and editing and so on? I like to try to assign out just to get a general scope of a project.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say on this one, probably about 8 to 9 hours of actual writing. And the thing is, though, I write a lot slower than I used to. Mm-hmm. I used to be a lot faster. And the thing was, when I was writing timely content at AV Club, where it was my job, and I was churning out, multiple articles a day, I was turning things around in 45 minutes. But those were usually shorter pieces, but even some of the longer ones, like reviews and stuff, you're never really working with a huge timetable. So you kind of have to turn things around quickly. So one of the things I'm actually kind of enjoying in this freelancing period I'm in, actually taking and spending more time with a piece than I usually would. So I guess in that sense, I'm writing slower, but I feel like I'm a little bit more painstaking about what I write these days. So 8 or 9 hours total, but a lot of that was broken up by various breaks and distractions and things like that.
Florida, so on.
Yeah, there was, I got people screaming in the pool outside, and I'm like so jealous. So
that's brutal. It's funny, 8 to 9 hours. I've talked to, I think this is episode 5 I will have recorded, but I always ask people about time spent on something, and it's almost been unanimously 8 to 9 hours, regardless of the project. I don't know. It's strange how that's worked. But I'm surprised that what you got done in 8 to 9 hours, I would have thought would have taken maybe double. So,
well, that doesn't count the interviews and everything, which are their own kind of work too. Yeah, because and prepping for interviews too, you want to make sure that you're prepared. So I mean, all in all, there was more, but I think in terms of sitting down, staring at the cursor, knocking it out. I mean, and that's the nice thing too about when you do a lot of interviews, is that you're also developing the piece as you speak to people and as you're transcribing, because you have to transcribe the interviews too. And a lot of times while you're transcribing, that's when you're sort of pulling the relevant quotes, right? Like, oh, this is what I'm going to use. This is what I'm going to use. The hardest thing about writing for me generally is transitioning, is is moving from one point to the next in a way that is elegant and smooth. And a lot of times like quotes can do that. Sometimes just a single turn of phrase, but that's usually the hardest part for me, is like making sure that I'm moving from one point to the next in a way that isn't jarring and that makes sense. And that was the thing in
your mind, it always makes sense. You're just like,
yeah. But with this piece, I remember there was a couple points where I know moving into sort of the final stretch of the article was a really, really tough transition. And I spent probably an hour just on that one small part. Like it ends up just being one line in the finished draft,
When you write, is it generally, are you do things in chunks, kind of sit down for a half hour, 45 minutes, get up, or are you a 5-6 hours straight kind of writer?
Definitely 5-6 hours straight. Yeah, okay. If I'm working, like I usually just, my wife calls it me being head down. It's like, I'm not paying attention to anything, and that's when, for me, a lot of times I need to get on a roll. And like the idea of momentum is very good to me. I'll take breaks, to like, get a glass of water or like pet the cat or something. But for the most part, it's, I pretty much just go straight, because I feel like if I'm taking longer breaks in between writing, then all I'm doing is thinking about what I'm writing. Sure. Like I'm always barreling towards the finish is kind of how I see it, because that's all I want is for the first draft to be done. Like, because the first draft is agony. It's misery, rewriting is so much better. So it's always me barreling towards the end. Yeah.
In terms of the process for the Ringer piece, is that generally representative of your writing process kind of as a freelance, is pitching something and then just kind of going through those steps more or less?
Yeah, I'd say so. Sometimes you have more time. I wrote a piece for the Ringer about a month and a half ago, and it was about a wrestler called The Fiend in WWE, and I was writing about horror movies and like horror and wrestling and sort of the intersection between them, and my headline was essentially like, is WWE finally telling a good horror story? And that piece was a lot different, because my word count that I was given was between 3,000 and 6,000 words. It ended up being around 4,000, and that's a much longer piece than the one we discussed, which was around 2,500. And that one involved a lot more research in terms of, I interviewed people, but I also was watching a lot of wrestling, like because the thing about wrestling that's so hard to write about is there's so goddamn much of it. Like, storylines are evolving constantly, and there's decades of storylines that you're sorting through, and you want to make sure you get them right, because if you don't, the wrestling historians will find you. Right. And so that one I had pitched pretty far out, and I had about 3 weeks to work on that one. Okay. So that one was I'd say a more like I didn't have as tight of a turnaround, so it was a little bit more of a relaxed process, but I was still writing, I'd say, in those 5 to 6 hour chunks where, I did all the legwork, and then it was like sit down and work. And that one, I think, since it was more laborious in terms of research and in terms of getting facts straight, and also interweaving the facts with opinion, it was a tougher piece to write, but I had more time, and it ended up being enough time. But I'd say I probably spent about 15 to 16 hours on that piece, because it was longer and more involved. So yeah, I like the Ringer because they do give the longer word count and just more room for writers to kind of most definitely. Yeah, that's nice. Obviously, you have autonomy over what you write and sort of what you do and don't do. But are there any kind of weird pitches that you haven't been able to do, or any ideas that you've tried over the years to sell people on that haven't come to fruition? I pitched one idea. The thing is, though, I couldn't write this. I just love the idea. And the thing is, it might still happen because Fast and Furious got delayed. But I thought it would be so funny for a writer to watch the first Fast and Furious movie and then watch the new one without watching anything in between, because there is the most insane franchise in terms of how it evolved. I'm a huge fan of it, but it's like the first movie and the last movie, they are completely like, it's a different franchise. And that's what's so funny about it. So anyways, that is the piece I wish I could write, but I've seen all those movies like 5 times, so I can't write that piece. I'm trying to think of others. I've been able to, because for a while, since, one of my good friends who I now run the podcast with, Mike Rothman, ran Consequence of Sound, we were able to write kind of anything we wanted, because he had, the control over that. and like the one thing we did that was so ambitious that I love was we did the Stephen King cinematic universe, which I think we wrote in like 2014. And essentially we mapped every King book that related to the Dark Tower and basically mapped out in what order they would be released in, and who would direct them and who would act in them. And, basically
wild. I've read it. It's wild.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
Yeah, man, we worked on that for a long time. And I remember the morning, like we all met about it in this diner in Chicago and just started mapping it out. And that was like a really cool piece because it was something that was like a labor of love that, the other people who worked at that site did not give a shit about,
Sure.
But we kind of put all of our effort into it. I think for me, I'm at this place where, I don't know. I think a lot of the ideas that I have in terms of stuff that I haven't fulfilled yet are things that I see for the podcast. And one of them actually is going to be coming out later this month, a thing that I've long wanted to do on the podcast, and it's coming out.
June 25th or something. There's a question mark.
I know it was supposed to come out last month. But,
expectations are high. You guys have been teasing it for a while. So.
I know. So that's a thing that I've been wanting to do for a long time that I'm so excited about. And it sort of marks like a new, I don't know, it scratches an itch that I've had for a while. So you'll get to see with that. And then, I think with my creative work in general, there's a lot of, various stories that I've wanted to tell in various forms. And now that I'm freelancing again, I sort of have the freedom to do it again. Yeah. So I'm thinking a lot in those terms. Yeah.
Yeah. Question that I had, and this is something that you talked about before in the past a little bit, and I want to get into King eventually here in a second because I don't get a chance to talk about King a ton, but is sort of writing a critical piece or a review, and I think like Stephen King complained that the AV Club never gave him anything higher than a B- on any of his books,
which is bullshit. I've given him higher than that.
Yeah,
no,
absolutely.
that was
you're
funny.
A very generous King grader.
I know I am.
Historically, especially the last couple of years with some of love the guy, but they haven't all.
Oh, I hear you.
How do so like when something like that happens, or you get sort of I don't necessarily want to wade into the waters of like toxic fandom because we already talked about that and it's just kind of beating a dead horse. But in terms of like getting backlash or feedback from the person who wrote for whom you're writing the piece about, like King, and I mean, he wasn't directing that at you solely, but when that happens, I guess how often does that happen? And when it happens, how do you kind of navigate that? Because I mean, you hear about like Lana Del Rey or someone like getting mad because Pitchfork gave her a bad review, but is that a common thing?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'll keep it short though. I think that a lot of times, I think that the journalist job, sometimes journalists can be too personal, which is where some of this comes from. I think sometimes because we live in social media culture and like the walls between celebrity and media are continuing to blur. I think that sometimes, so like when a subject gets upset, sometimes it's warranted, I think, because I think sometimes people people who are writing can take liberties in terms of characterizing a person that are unfair. There's something like that's going around. I don't know if you've seen anything around the Ellie Kemper discourse that's going around, and we don't need to get into it, but sure. I think that's an instance where people are sort of muddying the grander story by sort of adopting the easy narrative of attacking a single person when the actual story is much more complicated than that. And Ellie Kemper hasn't pushed back from what I can gather, but I wouldn't be surprised if she did, and she probably should. But I think that like with King, that was an instance of somebody being really whiny. And I love King to death, but he was mad, I think, because A.A. Dowd gave Dr. Sleep like a C+. It came right after that, and I know
that feels about right to me.
I know, and so in that instance, I think he was stung by that, and then lashed out at the entire organization because even though if you just do a quick glance of reviews, I think I gave the Institute like a B when I reviewed it, which was like a couple weeks before Dr. Sleep came out. So I was annoyed by that.
Yeah.
But so I think that it's kind of a fine line. But when people have come for me a couple times, but I'd like to think that people haven't really come for me in terms of, I'm very careful about how I write about people, and that I try not to make grand proclamations or judgments or project things onto people that aren't evident or aren't things that they have said. So I don't think an individual has ever come at me for being angry about something, but I have had organizations come at me because they weren't pleased with the way I framed them in an article. That's happened to me on multiple occasions. And I think that speaks to kind of the PR feeling emboldened in sort of this age of access journalism to basically threaten reporters and journalists by saying, I've been told I wouldn't have let you speak to this person if I had known your article was going to be critical. And the thing was, in every instance of this, my article was never even that critical.
Right.
But if you're not regurgitating the talking points they're giving you, and you are developing your own conclusions, and if they are not, wholly in service to the entity, they will come at you sometimes because they want to threaten you and intimidate you to not write things about them like that. Celebrity does that too. And I've luckily never been, I think one time I wrote an article about Nicki Minaj and I made a joke that, I just like made fun of her somehow, like not in a mean way. It was just a joke. Yeah. And the Stan Army came after me on Instagram briefly, but it was kind of a half-hearted attempt. Thank God. Like it didn't really pick up. But I did make my account private for a while because I got tagged in the replies to a Nicki Stan thing on Instagram, and they said, get him, like get him. And I was like, fuck. And I like immediately, went private because I'm terrified of these people, Yeah, and I was the internet culture editor at AV Club. So I used to write best and worst roundups of the internet at the end of the year. And usually on the worst list, and there would be some manifestation of stan culture. And I know you didn't want to talk about toxic fandom, so I won't go too deep, but I will say that, I think the reason that sort of thing happens more now than it used to is because there are these online armies. There are a lot of people out there, I call them billionaire defenders, who can't stand the concept of, Beyonce or Jay-Z or like, the Foo Fighters or Maroon 5 or like any of these really wildly successful acts being criticized in any meaningful way. And they are so popular that they have these bases that will go to bat for them. And that's the thing, is they sort of encourage that behavior, which is, it's certainly their right to do. But I think that there's been a lot of instances where people have had to defend an article against, you just call them bad faith attacks. And I think the best thing you can usually do in that instance, unless you did make a mistake, and that is often the case, I'm seeing that with the Ellie Kemper stuff, is usually just stand behind the article. Mm-hmm. Like the times that it's happened to me, you kind of just, the thing is like, even though these corporate entities might act like they're going to ice you out, they're not going to, because they need you. And so it's like, stand behind your article, stand behind what you said, and, don't be intimidated. Again, it's different if it's a personal thing. I will say, this is a story. One time I wrote a piece where, and this was early in my writing career. I wrote a piece where I like made fun of, somebody made like Zootopia, took a Zootopia, like it was Zootopia fan art, but it was all about, it ended up being like anti-abortion, and they were using the Zootopia characters to like shame people for being pro-choice. And I thought it was bizarre. And I wrote a piece that just kind of made fun of it, which was perhaps, immature on my part, but I thought it was really obnoxious. And the person who drew that was very, very upset, and kind of sent me 8,000 messages, like on Twitter in the middle of the night, which was a little scary. And that was an instance though, where I felt a little bad afterwards. And it's not an article I would write again today, because I think in those instances, what's the point? I think like when you're writing about online content, that's like a question I really needed to ask myself throughout the course of my job and my freelancing is like, is there really a point to write about this, or are you just making fun of something?
Right.
And
yeah.
I think early in my career,
you can do that without writing. You can just make fun of it yourself.
Yeah. And I think things should be made fun of a lot. I think that's a perfectly fine thing to do, but I mean, it depends, obviously, but it's a tricky question. And I think sometimes if you're writing an article that exists wholly to dunk on something, then perhaps the article itself doesn't need to exist. And that's something that I learned. And that was kind of an instance where this person, you know, regardless of their beliefs or whether or not I agree with their beliefs or the way that they're using children's entertainment to push these ideas on people, I found all of that pretty gross and reprehensible. But at the same time, I don't know if it was necessarily my place to project that to, you know, tens of thousands of readers for this person to get dunked on.
Yeah.
I have one of the things I think I learned in the process of media writing was that I didn't want to be someone to inflame culture wars anymore. You know, like the general concept of arguing about things that ultimately don't really matter.
Right.
I think that it's an easy trap for people to fall into. And it's a lesson I think I learned throughout the course of my job is that there's no real point in inflaming pointless arguments.
Right.
And, but the thing is, and this is what's hard, is that's the stuff that gets all the clicks. That's the stuff everybody wants to read. Yeah. And this is the modern conundrum with media these days, especially pop culture media, is all people want to do is argue about Marvel movies and argue about Pete Davidson and argue about all of this bullshit that really doesn't matter. And it's just, ultimately it's just kind of like what you like, but that doesn't get clicks. So that's the hard thing. And it's another reason that I'm happy I'm not full-time in that industry anymore, because, you know, it's hard. And it's again,
probably feels kind of morally bankrupt as well.
It can,
think.
And there's a lot of great pop culture writing, but if that's the kind of stuff you're churning out, then it is bankrupt. Yeah. And I think that was something that weighed on me as I navigated that, because that's the thing is you are navigating so much content and so much pressure to put out things that people read that it is difficult. Like, you know, we don't need another article about how Ted Cruz sucks. You know what I mean? Like we can do something more productive with that. And I think that's sort of, I kind of went on a tangent there, but I think that ties in a sense to the intention behind what you're writing, because I feel like if an individual is coming after you over something you've written, it probably has to do with the intent behind the article. Right. With the Lana Del Rey stuff, I can almost see why she was mad. But at the same time, I think she was also out of line because she was attacking writers that were mostly positive reviews, but they didn't. But the thing was, she didn't like that they were making assumptions about her personal life, and so it's a trade-off in that sense. But at the same time, Lana Del Rey knows that by doing what she's doing and not having the conversation in private rather than in public, she is sort of amassing the online base. Right. And I think that's the thing is if there is a real issue and it is a real bothersome thing, that stuff can usually be worked out in private. So
yeah. How you doing on time? You okay?
Yeah, I can go a little longer.
Okay. All right, cool. Right. So yeah, I just want to talk King a little bit. King's sure. King's Corner, we'll call it. Stupid. All right. So a couple weeks now, maybe a couple months ago at this point, you guys, the Losers Club, joined the Bloody Disgusting Network. And around the same time, I saw a tweet from King acknowledging that he had listened to the podcast, which must have been very exciting, I would imagine.
Yeah, we lost our shit.
After years of speculation and kind of wondering, I was in Florida myself, and even I felt kind of happy for you guys.
Thank you so much.
Of course. But in terms of King and the podcast, I guess all right, let's say in a hypothetical, and I'm sure you've tried to get him on in various ways over the years, but let's say you got him on and it's you and King one-on-one. What's the first question you're going to ask him?
That's a good question. We've talked about this on the pod a little bit. And I think the big question was okay, the answer is ultimately yes, we would want to interview him. Right. But I think it's there are arguments to be made for it not interviewing him, because I think a big thing about the podcast is we're not a fan cast. We're critical. I'd like to think we're a literary podcast about Stephen King, in that we embrace the best of him and the worst of him. And the thing is, once you kind of invite the subject into the orbit of your podcast, then I think opinions start to become compromised, and that you start to worry about the person listening, and you start to be maybe not as critical as you were previously, and it can corrupt in that sense. But that said, of course, we would have him on if he ever wanted to. But yeah, my first question would probably be, well, I almost joke, like, where do you get your ideas? Because he hates that question so much.
Thanks for the nightmares.
I know. I'd probably say, like, I'd want to hear about, and I've talked about this too, like, because we had a question one time in a mailbag episode about, like, what book would you want to talk to him about specifically? And I think for me, I'd want to talk about the Tommyknockers, because that is an incredibly weird, strange book that he also wrote when he was at the height of his addiction and right on the verge of getting sober. And I'd love to hear him talk about, because that book is also all about addiction and the ravages of addiction, and Misery was too, which came out right before it. And I think that I would love to hear about him, sort of because he hates for that book too. He's not happy with that book. And I think the writing process for it was not pleasant. So I'd love to hear him talk about that and talk about what it was like to struggle with a book like that while you were struggling with your addiction in that kind of sense. Because I think it's a really telling and revealing part, because he got sober right after that. And he's written a lot about his sobriety, like in his work and elsewhere. And so clearly, I think it was a really pivotal time for him as a writer and as a person. And so, yeah, I think I'd want to be like, tell me about writing the Tommyknockers.
Yeah,
so,
you'd probably be one of the few people to
I know, right?
Want to go deep on Tina.
Well, that's another reason too, because I feel like he hasn't talked about it a lot, you know, and that's one that, like, I always want to know the stories behind the books he doesn't talk about. So.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good one. I thought it might be bully related, but
yeah, there's that too.
Yeah.
I'd just be like, who bullied you when you were young? So
so you've been doing the pod for, I don't know, is it like 4 years now?
Yeah,
4 or 5
2017,
years?
yeah.
2017. What have been some of the big, like, takeaways or surprises over the run? Positive, negative, etc.
It's a good question. I think the positives would be I mentioned sort of the idea of him struggling with addiction. And I think navigating that journey throughout, like, reading his books chronologically like we have been, and also juxtaposing it with what he was going through at the time and what his life looked like at the time, that to me has been the most revealing part. And that I feel like I'm getting to know him as a person a little bit more, not in the sense that I know him, but you gain certain context and you understand, you view his works through a different lens when you kind of you're kind of riding on the momentum of all that came before it. And you're also, like, watching his life unfold in terms of how it has unfolded through history and what he said and his quotes about various things. And I think for me, we have two sober people on the show, and Anna Marie Cox and Jen Adams, and they've both been very forthcoming about their own experiences with sobriety. And so working through his books in this era of King, which we're currently in, which is where he's really reckoning, I think, with his sobriety. Desperation was a good example of that. That discussion we had about that, where we talked about God, especially God as he exists in recovery, and the difficulties of sobriety, and talking about it with Jen and Anna has been really illuminating, just really cool for me, and something that it's a topic I've never really considered, because I don't have addiction doesn't run in my family. It's not something I've struggled with. And so, but I think hearing through their lens and reading it in King's books and watching it, you know, the way he discusses it in On Writing and elsewhere, I think that's been one of the positives, is feeling like I'm learning about this really difficult experience that he went through in a way that feels intensely personal. Yeah. And I feel like it's drawn me closer to his works in those ways. So yeah, that's one example. In terms of negatives, I think I've just realized that there's certain books that I really loved when I was young that just don't quite hit like they do. Some do, you know, some I still love. But, you know, I think The Stand for me was almost kind of sad, because that was like my favorite book growing up, and I still love it. Like, I don't think it's a bad book by any means, but I think rereading it for the podcast, and we've revisited it so many times because
Right.
We reviewed the miniseries. We revisited the miniseries at the beginning of the pandemic because we thought it would be funny, and then it just depressed us. And then we did the whole TV show. And so I feel like I've spent so much time with that book to the point where like I've realized that there's aspects of it I really don't like, and aspects of it I really struggle with. And also I just doubt I'll ever revisit it because I feel like I've like when we wrapped on the Stand TV series episodes, like I think I talked about it in the episode. I was like, there's almost something sad about this because I feel like I'm done with this book now. Like I'm done with this story. And that's the first King book I ever read. It's the book that introduced me to him. And so I have a really strong affection for it. And I feel like my relationship with it has been irrevocably changed and in ways that are a little bit sad, but not wholly. And so I don't know. I think so. There's that aspect of it, and then there's a few other books. Like I remember I really liked all the Bachman books when I was growing up, and now I mostly hate them except for The Long Walk. So there was that too.
I'm kind of a road work guy. I really I had a tough time with you guys. Really bagging road work. I don't know. I'm kind of a Barton Dawes guy, unfortunately, for better or worse.
No shame. We welcome all opinions. So so there's those aspects. And then also, I mean, honestly, I'm rereading Lisi's story right now, and I'm really struggling with it. Okay. And that's tough because it's King's favorite book that he's ever written, and I'm just like, I hate this book.
I feel like that's just like I don't know. I feel like when you say stuff like that, like, is that really your favorite book you've ever? It's not like Pet Sematary or something.
I know. Well, he kind of hates Pet Sematary,
that's true,
which is interesting.
Yeah.
But because that is easily probably my favorite book of his.
Yeah.
So.
Same.
Yeah.
That's funny. Have you read Billy Summers yet? Have you gotten?
No, we haven't gotten it yet. I'm looking forward to it though. I mean, we'll see. But Later I thought was a pretty good surprise. We really liked that one. And Billy Summers, I'm open-minded about it. I hope it's got some twists in it. I hope it's not just kind of another straight crime book. Right. I hope he's got something up his sleeve. No Gibney. Keep her out of it.
No Gibney allowed.
Just Billy, no Gibney. So
that's funny. How much more output you think there's going to be over the next couple of years? How is it like? I just envision a scenario where he's churning 2 books out for the rest of my life. I know it's not sustainable.
I know, right?
He's really kept at it in an amazing way, and some of it's been great, some of it's not. But I'm always happy to read. So.
Yeah, same. I know he keeps saying he's slowing down, but then he keeps announcing new things, which is great. Yeah. But I think it's a compulsion for him, and I think until he's like unable to do it, he's going to keep doing it. And so I don't know. I'm looking forward. I feel like he's at least got another 10 years in him. Yeah. And does that mean 2 books every year? I doubt it, but it's going to be the saddest fucking day in the world when he's gone.
I saw him out in Maine, out in Minneapolis a couple of years ago for a literary festival, and he did a panel, and I saw the Remainders play. Boy, they rocked.
I would give anything. I've never seen him in person or anything. So
yeah, it was wild. It was probably 20 feet away. He wore a Maine shirt and a Red Sox hat. So what more can you ask for?
Love it.
Earth guy.
Very Stevie.
One thing he said was, and I'd never really heard him say that before, was how as he got older, he was really afraid of kind of losing like Alzheimer's almost, and kind of losing his faculties, because once that happened, it was just and that was like something he worried about like on a daily basis. And I thought it was interesting because it was a real like rah crowd, and it really brought people down. And like people were like, "Oh man, Stephen King's worried about all." Like it really brought the mood down. I just thought it was very fascinating that he would be so open. But
I think his filter's really off, which gets him. It's funny because it gets him in trouble sometimes. I think with sort of the modern internet, he's clearly, like I wrote about that in our newsletter. He's not quite accustomed to modern internet, and so it's kind of interesting to watch him navigate it at his age. But I mean, the nice thing is he's so good natured and he's so good-hearted. Yeah. He means well, and I think most people can recognize that. Yeah.
Yeah. Every once in a while, there'll be a weird joke about like a server or a waitress.
I know.
And you'll think like, what? Who's that for?
He just kind of wanders into a thorn bush, and it's like it's his like 50s, 60s upbringing, like coming back to haunt him,
Right.
And then he's always quick though to say, all right,
it's like, hey, all right. And that concludes King's Corner. Just 2 more questions, and then I'll let you off the hook. I really appreciate you talking to me today.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So this is a question I wanted to ask. To what extent do you think growing up in Michigan or the Midwest kind of colors your writing?
Very much so. I can't even express that enough. I think wherever you're born really colors it. But for me, I sometimes felt like I was robbed growing up a little bit when I would go visit other places. And I think people get to grow up by the ocean or by the mountains, and it's so beautiful. And I was very much raised, by a highway with McDonald's and Myers all over the place, and I remember resenting my friends who grew up around beauty. And I think that's something that it took me a while to, of course I still wish that I grew up in a beautiful locale,
Sure.
but I think that I've embraced it in my writing in the sense that that's true for a lot of people. I think a lot of people grew up in suburban, in kind of maybe, faceless suburban areas or places that were really kind of dominated by corporate chains and not a lot of personality. And I think one of the challenges is developing a personality within that. Obviously I think everybody does, but sometimes you kind of are forced to find beauty elsewhere. And I think that was true for me a lot. I used to read a lot to escape and imagine myself living in other places. So I think in my writing, I very much write about people who didn't come from means, who grew up in places that some might consider boilerplate or boring or stifling. And I think it really is about, and then also just capturing the experience of people who grew up sort of in McDonald's and Burger Kings and Targets and places like that. And because I think that there is a, kind of a deep humanity in all of that. Because, I think a lot of people look back on, if you grew up sort of in a beautiful, town by the water, you have all these memories of going to the beach and going, doing all these really beautiful things. And I think when I was young, the most exciting thing in the world was to get like McDonald's on a Saturday night,
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think writing about that sort of life and that kind of milieu, I think that does actually speak to people because not a lot of people write about it because it's not glamorous, So yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, no, I think like that. I think that makes sense. What some of your favorite pieces you've written? Any stand out?
Yeah, I've written so many.
Besides the Groupon oil change piece, obviously.
All my Groupons were the best things.
Yeah.
No, I wrote this piece because I write about faith a lot because I spent some time as an evangelical Christian when I was younger. And I think any piece I've written about that has always been meaningful to me because that was a really meaningful time in my life. I wrote a piece for the AV Club probably back in 2016, maybe about faith-based movies and whether or not they can a spiritual or can a Christian movie ever really transcend propaganda? And I really like how that piece turned out. And I believe if you want to Google it, it's like can faith-based film. God, I can't even remember. I think it's something transcend propaganda on the AV Club.
I'll find it.
That's a piece I'm really proud of that I put a lot of work into, and I think has some truth to it. I also wrote a piece about the Passion of the Christ on its, I believe it was its 15th anniversary. And that was about, I basically interviewed a bunch of people who watched it when they were way too young to watch it and how that movie kind of fucked people up because I think like a lot of churches were taking children to go see it. And I witnessed this firsthand. I was a little bit older, so it didn't really affect me, but I was watching a lot of children watch it and that was very disturbing. And I wrote a lot about how that impacted people's faith. And I also just wrote about the Passion of the Christ, how it sort of represents the evangelical warhammer that, and how Mel Gibson's kind of wielded that. It was sort of the blunt force trauma that it used to kind of draw people into evangelicalism. And it was obviously, very post 9/11 and representative of that era. And which is an era I'm fascinated with and is when my novel is set. So those pieces I think are definitely important. I wrote a piece about, speaking of Saved by the Bell, I wrote a piece about the nerds in Saved by the Bell, specifically for the AV Club, probably about 2 years ago, where I wrote about basically how it feels to because the nerds were so cartoony in that show and like what they represented, but I also used it as a means to explore in concepts of bullying, which I'm obviously I talk on the Losers Club a lot about Stephen King's use of bullies and what that represents, and I'm fascinated by bullying as a topic and the way it shapes people, and so I wrote about that as well in that piece. And then Yeah, I've written so much. Like, those are the pieces that instantly come to mind.
Okay.
But when you write for a living, when you're freelancing, you churn out so many pieces, and some of them I think are like, uh, I know I've written pieces that I love that I can't remember anymore because because when you churn out so much, it all just becomes gobbledygook in your mind.
Yep.
So, and then obviously I'm proud of all the plays I've written. And some of them are still being produced out there, and I'm under commission currently working on a musical that will hopefully go up in Chicago sometime in the next few years. So always proud of those as well.
Yeah, awesome. I'll be sure and include some links to that stuff for people to read. Advice for potential aspiring sort of freelancers, culture writers, critics, someone fresh out of college trying to make their way?
I mean, yes, you're writing, you should be paid for your writing, but you're probably not going to be until you write for free a bit. You need clips under your belt. Otherwise, people will not publish you. That's a big one. And don't be afraid to hound editors. Write clear pitches. Always have a thesis. These are sort of, I think the best things to know. And don't try to write like other people. Right. I know that's a hard thing to just tell people because we always kind of start, right? Like, John Guare, the playwright, has a story about how he wrote, when he was young, he read the first two acts of Chekhov's Three Sisters and thought it was amazing. So he wrote a third act himself, before he even read the third act. And then August Wilson always talks about how you begin writing like the writers that you loved. And I think that's a great way to start. But I think ultimately, as you do find your voice eventually, don't be scared of that and like own that and embrace that, because it is whatever it is that you bring special to the table is what people want to read from you, not whatever it is you think people want to read. Always embrace whatever it is that's coming out of you organically.
Yeah, I think that's sound advice. Yeah, I think definitely can relate to start, you start writing and you just write about this, you write like the people you like about the things that you like. And it's
that was me with Michael Crichton and Stephen
sameness.
King. Yeah, I started writing like Michael Crichton and Stephen King, and then eventually, you find your way into your own voice. So
yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I've taken up too much of your time. On the way out, any plugs, Losers Club, anything else?
Yeah, listen to the Losers Club podcast. You can find it on all major podcasting hubs. We've got a lot of fun stuff coming up. And yeah, you can find my writing on the internet. These days, I've been writing a lot at The Ringer. And you can find me on Twitter at Randall Colburn, just my full name. And I don't tweet a lot, but I read a lot of tweets. So, there's that. So, but thanks for having me.
Yeah, Randall, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time, so I really appreciate this. And it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, well, take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.